Ladies and gentlemen, I hope before we begin the more formal but nonetheless entertaining part of the evening, I want to pause and give special thanks to two members who unfortunately cannot be with us this evening. I hope everybody can hear and see. There's a very interesting new alignment over there. I noticed this taking place. The first person I want to mention is Paul Henderson Scott, a long-standing council member of the club. Even the shortest glimpse at Paul's CV points to a remarkable career. Born in Edinburgh in 1920 and educated here at the Royal High School and Edinburgh University, he served as an officer in the 7th Armoured Division in Belgium, Holland and Germany during the war, after which he eventually joined the Foreign Office, working as a diplomat in Bonn, Warsaw, Montreal, Vienna and on other postings. He was in Havana during the missile crisis in 1962. Since retiring in 1996 and returning to Edinburgh, he's written at least 15 books and edited 9, these including his Walter Scott and Scotland 1981 and an edition of Scott's Letters of Malachi Malagriver, also 1991. I first met Paul while we were on a joint panel at a Scott conference in Aberdeen in 1982, where I spoke on Scott and the Regalia, seeing in this a deliberate assimilation on Scott's part of an older Scottish patriotism into a wide British context, and where Paul argued in a contrary direction, sensing an undercurrent of nationalism in Scott relevant to the politics of today's SNP, of which he became vice chairman. We crossed swords, or rather pens, after that, but never with personal animus on his part. And looking back, I rather sense that we were both right in different ways. Scott having strong allegiances on Scottish, British, and indeed European fronts. Notwithstanding his busy life, Paul was always there for the club, helping steer it through some of its more difficult times, and it was ill health alone that led to his resignation from council last year, and he will be sorely missed. The other person I want to mention here is Peter C. Millar, whose wife Kathleen contacted the club in January to say that he was no longer fit enough to attend meetings. Though not known to me personally, I understand that Mr. Millar was on-secretary of the Scott Club for the best part of the 1970s, and in that key role can be counted as one of those vital to the club's continuance since its foundation in 1894. He remained a member of council until the early 1990s. Now this year we have as our president one of the leading Scott academics of today, Professor Alison, or Ali for short, Lumsden. A native of Lossiemouth and stemming from the fishing communities in northeast Scotland, Ali gained her MA at Aberdeen University before completing a doctorate at the University of Edinburgh. Her first academic post was as a research fellow on the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels EEWN, and this is how we first met. One of the main roles of the research fellow was to undertake collations of Scott's original manuscripts, a task which meant noting on forms every variant between the manuscripts and typically the first printed edition. As the prospective editor of Waverley, I was privileged to receive from Ali the collation relating to that novel, and I cannot praise too highly the methodical detail, intuitive insight, and not least high degree of legibility that went into this work. My own comparatively scruffy collation as volume editor paled in comparison, being only interpretable by myself, whereas any reasonably knowledgeable person could have benefited from Ali's. Her own individual publications for EEWN, which then went on to include an edition with our former president, Jerry Carruthers of Reliquiae Trotskienses, Scott's somewhat quirky account of his Abbotsford library, are listed on your menu, as to an indication of some of the fruits of a stellar career as an academic at Aberdeen, where she co-directs the Walter Scott Research Centre, as well as holding a variety of outreach posts, such as her honorary librarianship at Abbotsford. Ní bad for a queen for Frey Lossie. Sorry, Ali's given me some coaching in the Doric, and that's the best I could do on the spot. I won't make another attempt in case it gets worse, okay? I think we've got the gist of it anyway. As her mother is reported as saying, currently she is general editor of a new scholarly edition of Walter Scott's poetry, the first volume of which, Marmion, is due for publication this June, and we left leaflets on the seats. This evening, I understand she wishes to talk about Scott's international reach, while adding some more material about her own life in being, partly at least, wedded to Scott. Alison Lumsden.
Thank you, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott friends. First of all, I would like to thank Peter Lee and the Council of the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club for the honour they've granted me in inviting me to be president this year. I cannot express how much that has meant to me, and I really am humbled when I look at the list of presidents who've gone before me. So thank you very, very much indeed for this honour. This talk was originally scheduled to be on World Book Day, and there seemed to be no better time to be celebrating the achievements of Walter Scott. Scott, after all, was in many ways the first world author, and there's no doubt but that his legacy extends around the globe. Scott's interest in Romanticism was inspired by reading German poetry, and some of his first work was translating it. And as the colleagues I worked with on the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels have shown, some of whom are here tonight, by 1820, Scott, along with Constable and Company, were sending late proofs of the Waverley novels to Philadelphia so that it could be published almost simultaneously in America. Translations of Scott's work appeared in languages such as French, Swedish, Russian and German, in some cases within months of their original publication. And we're very lucky at the University of Aberdeen to have many of these in our Bernard C. Lloyd collection. A very quick look at the library catalogue will demonstrate just how far and how quickly Scott's influence was travelling. His influence on Europe was, as critics such as Murray Pittock have demonstrated, profound, and the legacy he granted to American literature is beyond dispute. This legacy was of course compounded by the many adaptations of Scott's work in the form of popular culture, such as chapbooks, comic books and children's editions, and also high art. Only Shakespeare has more operas derived from his work than Walter Scott. As Anne Rigney has demonstrated so admirably in her book, The Afterlives of Walter Scott, Scott's legacy is deep and far-ranging. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege of experiencing this firsthand when I was invited to take part in an event at the University of Curtin in Western Australia. Curtin is a partner university of the University of Aberdeen, and it's also home to the China-Australia Writing Centre. And they were organising a weekend of radio broadcasts in collaboration with the Australian Broadcasting Company, ABC. I was invited to take part in a discussion on the novel Through Time with Kim Scott, who is an Australian novelist of Aboriginal descent working at Curtin, and Professor Tang Zheng from Fudan University in Shanghai, who's an expert on Shakespeare and Oscar Wilde. I'd been asked specifically to comment on Walter Scott's role in the development of the novel and the relevance of his work for today. Now, this was a live recording, and I must admit that as I travelled to Australia, I was rather nervous at the prospect. It's a long way to go and be worried. Australia seemed very far away indeed from Scotland, and I wondered just how well Scott would hold up both at this distance, both in miles and time. How could I make a case for Scott in the company of my Australian and Chinese colleagues? I should have had more faith in Scott. I should not have worried. As the three of us began to discuss why we thought the novel is an important and lasting form, and what it can offer society today, everything that was being said was relevant for Scott. The novel, we concluded, helps us to understand both ourselves and our societies better. It allows us to empathise with those who we can never meet in person and with those who may not share our own political or religious beliefs. Indeed, those from the other side of the world. At its best, it can make us better people and people who are equipped to understand others. It helps to reflect who we are and for us to reflect upon who we are and how we got here. It even helps us to consider questions about where we as individuals and societies may wish to go next. Now, all of that could be relevant to a description of reading the Waverley novels, at least for me. Scott, it transpires, travels very well indeed, both in terms of miles and years. I would also add that going to Western Australia to speak about Scott allowed me to indulge in one of my guilty and secret pleasures. As a colleague was driving me to Fremantle, where I was staying during my visit, I spotted a road sign in a suburban housing estate, Marmion Crescent. I don't think she quite understood why I asked her to stop so that I could take a photo of the suburban Australian scene, but of course all of you will appreciate it. This is more evidence, if we need it, of Scott's international reach. And I have to confess that wherever I travel in the world, I'm on the lookout for evidence like this of Scott's influence. It isn't very hard to find. You can do it yourselves, you probably do. You probably have this guilty pleasure to look at the phone book when you visit somewhere. You'll find Abbotsford Crescents and Marmion Ways. Indeed, my long-suffering husband can testify to this only too well. Having spent the majority of our holidays as add-ons to Scott conferences or trips to archives to look at Scott manuscripts, my husband decided that we needed a holiday that had nothing to do with Walter Scott. And so he booked a holiday to Malta. I didn't quite have the heart to tell him about the Scott connection. But of course, as we were wandering around Valletta, we eventually encountered the plaque telling us that Scott had stayed there. Was there anywhere in the world where you could get away from Scott, he asked. Probably not, but it's an interesting challenge for our next holiday. But my experience of Scott began much closer to home. As Peter mentioned in his kind introduction and in his excellent Doric, I was brought up and born in Lossiemouth in the northeast of Scotland. Now I have to confess that my childhood reading didn't include Scott. I was addicted to the famous five, Little Women and the Railway Children. And as I grew older, Jane Austen, the Brontes and Thomas Hardy. Although I was an avid reader, it's interesting that none of my teachers in the 1970s suggested that I should read Walter Scott. And it would be interesting to ask and ponder upon whether that is now changed. I know the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club very kindly supported a CPD event for teachers with the ASLS a few years ago. And as president of the ASLS, I'm very grateful for that. And it's interesting to note that after that event, at our next schools conference, our Scott teaching note, which was on short stories by Scott, actually about 100 copies of it were taken away. So teachers are clearly interested in teaching Scott. I don't think anybody wants children to perhaps embark on reading Waverley when they're 12 anymore, as they maybe did in the past, but by introducing children to short stories, to passages from the novels, I do believe they can become interested in Scott. But nobody suggested that to me. But I did encounter Scott in another way in my childhood. As some of you will know, Lossiemouth is the birthplace of Britain's first Labour Prime Minister, James Ramsay MacDonald. Now, Ramsay MacDonald never forgot his connections with the North East and with Lossiemouth, and he built a house there called the Hillocks. And my great-aunt worked as his housekeeper. My great-grandfather, breaking with the tradition that fishing boats are nearly always female, named his fishing boat the Ramsay MacDonald in the year Lord Loon of Lossy, to use Lewis Grosset Gibbon's phrase, became Prime Minister. And when I was a child, MacDonald's daughter, Ishbel, still lived in the Hillocks. And my mother worked for her for a time as a secretary. Ishbel was writing her memoirs, and she employed my mother, who'd found herself a single mother with 2 small children, to help her work on her memoirs. As children, we would visit the Hillocks, and one of the first things you see as you enter the house is a picture of Walter Scott. Ishbel also told us that her father had maintained his love for Scottish literature during his time in London. J.M. Barrie, it turns out, was a frequent visitor at Downing Street. But every night before they went to sleep, MacDonald would read to his children, and what he read them was Walter Scott. MacDonald's granddaughter still lives in the house, and the picture of Walter Scott is still there. It's still the first thing you see in Pride of Place when you enter the Hillocks. Now, to some, James Ramsay MacDonald and Walter Scott might seem like rather strange intellectual companions. All the more so that in recent years I think a rather unfortunate tendency has developed to set the idea of a radical and socialist Robert Burns against the idea of a Tory unionist and somewhat reactionary Walter Scott. This is a lazy juxtaposition and does neither writer any real service, and overlooks the complexities of Scott's political sympathies and opinions. The more I've come to know of Scott, the less MacDonald's fondness for him surprises me. After all, Scott's novels were reinvigorated for the 20th century by the Marxist critic George Lukács, on the basis that they explore historical process and the ways in which societies shape themselves at moments of historical crisis. So too, we should not overlook the fact that Scott's novels are peopled with characters of lower class origin, and that often they explore the ways in which these, sometimes marginal characters, are sidelined by the ongoing trajectories of progress. Gypsies, pirates, and lower class women are often the most fascinating characters in Scott's work, and their fates pull against the ideas of progress and reconciliation that seemingly predominate. We could think of Meg Merrilies' Madge Wildfire, or Norna of the Fitful Head. In Jeanie Dean, Scott also gives us one of the first working class heroines, and of course we've heard about Jeanie already tonight. And the covenanting values that she embodies are, of course, also politically radical ones. Perhaps nowhere is the plight of ordinary people better expressed, however, than in The Antiquary, Scott's own favourite of his fictions, when the fisherman Saunders Mucklebucket tells Oldbuck that he has no option but to work when his son Steenie has drowned, as otherwise his children will starve. And what would you have me do, he tells Oldbuck, unless I want to see 4 children starve because ane is drowned? It's weel wi' your gentles that can sit in the hoose wi' your handkerchers at your een when you lose a freen. But the like o' us maun to work again if our hearts were beating as hard as my hammer. It's hardly surprising that scenes like these would have struck a chord with MacDonald, himself from a fishing village, my fishing village, where losses at sea were and are frequent. Recently, more evidence has come to light of Scott's long life interest in popular culture in the discovery and cataloguing of nearly 3,000 chapbooks at Abbotsford. As I'm sure you all know, chapbooks represent ephemeral literature, and literature that both gives accounts of ordinary experience and was circulated among ordinary people. Until recently, the received opinion was that Scott owned around 200 chapbooks collected by him as a teenager. In fact, there are nearly 3,000 chapbooks at Abbotsford, and the cataloguing of them reveals that Scott had a lifelong and sustained interest in this material, which covers a wide range of political opinion, often offers accounts of hangings and dying words, and captures a wealth of information about popular pastimes and customs, much of which Scott draws upon in his writing. Support from the Royal Society of Edinburgh offers the opportunity to explore the significance of these chapbooks more fully over the next 2 years, and my colleague Jenny Carruthers from the University of Glasgow and myself will be leading a project to examine the importance of Scott's collection, which will culminate in an exhibition at Abbotsford in 2020. Now, while I don't want to preempt the findings of this project, it is certainly clear that the Abbotsford chapbook collection in some ways recalibrates our understanding of Scott and helps renegotiate his relationship to Scottish culture and ordinary life. Scott, it seems, is not quite as embedded in the highbrow as some might like to believe. What I'm suggesting here, then, is that Scott is perhaps a more complex and nuanced writer than is sometimes recognised. Indeed, that's the reason why I've chosen to spend so much of my life in his company. As I said earlier, this is where I admit I'm actually a fraud. I didn't really encounter Scott's work as a child, and I didn't even read Scott at university. David can pull my leg about that. In fact, I didn't discover Scott until I went to Edinburgh to do a PhD. My original plan for a PhD thesis had been to work on contemporary Scottish literature. It was the 1980s and we'd all gone theory mad. And so my plan was to write about the postmodern Scottish novel that's a blast from the past and also ages me horribly. However, I wisely decided that I'd better find out something about earlier 19th century Scottish literature before I took on this project. And so I thought I'd better read a bit of Walter Scott, who I'd never read before. I began with Waverley, of course. Where else would you begin? But then I moved on to the other novels. And of course, what I discovered was that Scott was much more intellectually stimulating, at least for me, than the contemporary novels I'd planned to write about. And so instead of my original plan, and I would not give this advice to my PhD students, I ended up writing my PhD thesis on Walter Scott's fiction, along with that of Hogg and Stevenson. Thus began my life with Walter Scott. As Peter had already told you, when I completed my PhD, I began working as a research fellow on the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels. And in spite of a couple of breakout attempts, I have never really escaped. I did try occasionally. But what a privilege spending my life with Scott has been. In the early years, as we've heard, my role with the Edinburgh edition was mostly to collate the manuscripts of the novels against the first editions. And so I spent a great deal of my time deciphering Scott's handwriting, examining the changes he'd made to his work as he wrote, and one of my favourite pastimes, deciphering what he'd written before deleting it, even when he tried really hard to obliterate it. That became one of my favourite things. But what a wonderful way to earn your living. And from this I formed a growing appreciation of Scott as a creative practitioner, as a writer. Scott's ideas are interesting, we all know that, but he's sometimes not seen as a great craftsman. Sometimes he's still read as slapdash, churning out novels at an astonishing rate. But as I'm sure Peter and David would agree, working in Scott's texts for the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels alters that perception. And his manuscripts tell us that Scott is far more careful than we might have believed at finding the right form of expression and the appropriate word to capture meaning as he tells his story. Scott's fiction also demonstrates the linguistic range with which he is operating, some of which was lost in the early editions of his work and is now restored due to the work of people in this room in the Edinburgh edition. I'm going to give you two of my favourite examples because I can't resist them. One of them is from Scott's novel The Pirate, which I co-edited. And in The Pirate, as you would imagine, there are pirates, and towards the end of the novel they fall out. And one of them turns to the other in the first edition of the novel and says, "Well, I've done caring for you." And you think, well, that's fine, but it's not very piratical. Is that the sort of thing a pirate's going to say to another pirate? "I'm done caring for you now. Go your own ways." Well, we looked at the manuscript, which is at Princeton University, and it was quite apparent that is not what the manuscript says. There are far too many squiggles in the middle of the word for it to be caring. And as I sat there, I thought, well, to me it looks like canning, but that doesn't make sense either. You know, they're going to be going off putting raspberries in tins or something. And so I went to the dictionary, and lo and behold, the word canning, as maybe some of you who sail know, means to steer a course. So what one pirate is saying to the other is, "I will no longer steer your course," which is a much better reading of the novel. So that's what's restored in the Edinburgh edition. My other example's more local, and it's in the heart of Midlothian, and it certainly is one of my favourites. It's the one I always use when I'm teaching textual editing. There's a point in the novel where we're told that the majority of the citizens in Edinburgh live outside the city walls. And that has stood for 200 years and nobody had challenged that. But think about it. Essentially it says the majority of people who live in Edinburgh don't live in Edinburgh. Doesn't really make much sense. In the manuscript, what it actually says is the majority of artisans live outside the city wall. But if you think of the words citizens and artisans in handwriting, they're remarkably similar. Scott's making a very nuanced social economic point, which has been completely lost in the first edition and now restored. Now, once I'd worked on the Edinburgh edition for a while, David let me loose on doing things beyond manuscripts. Although I'd have to say that is still my favourite activity. I don't like handing it over to other people. I want to do the manuscript work. But I began to research material for the notes for the Edinburgh edition. And that opens up a whole new appreciation for Scott, because it allows us to see the intellectual sphere in which he's operating and the vast range of knowledge upon which he draws. Sometimes people ask me why I haven't got bored spending what's now getting on for 30 years working on Scott. And that's because you can't possibly get bored by Scott and the knowledge upon which he draws. Other authors might actually get a bit tedious after a while. But you can be researching notes on Jacobitism, the Covenanting Wars, or Charles II, but you can also be tracking down details of 19th century recipes, the origins of port as a drink, or obscure rules of golf and angling. You don't get bored because Scott has so much knowledge, and you can really never get to the end of it. Scott always expands our minds. He never diminishes us. As many of you have known, and as Peter said, most recently I have, with Peter, David Hewitt, Gillian Hughes and Ainsley Mackintosh, embarked on an edition of Scott's poetry, and you have the leaflet about Marmion tonight. That will be published in June or July. Peter and Gillian's volume of Scott's shorter poems will be published next year. Turning towards Scott's poems opens up whole new avenues as a kind of way of experiencing Scott. I think perhaps there's been a bit of, we've been guilty of perhaps seeing Scott's poetry merely as a kind of prelude to his fiction, an appetiser for the main course, if you like. However, re-engaging with the poems for the purpose of editing them is a reminder that nothing could be further from the truth, and a reminder too of why it was as a poet that Scott was first celebrated by his contemporaries, and perhaps most celebrated in his own lifetime. In their engagement with historical and personal relationships, in their formal and generic complexity, and in their sheer brilliance in storytelling, the poems offer us the opportunity to rediscover what captured the imagination of readers when Marmion or the Lady of the Lake first appeared, and to understand the profound effect they produced both within Scotland and far beyond it. But my journey with Scott also has a further and perhaps a most exciting aspect to it, and that is in my role as Honorary Librarian at Abbotsford. I first began working at Abbotsford about 20 years ago, when under the guidance of Douglas Gifford, Jerry Carruthers and myself were involved in stock check of the library against the Cochrane catalogue. It was an extremely rare privilege for a young Scots scholar to be able to open up the cabinets in the Abbotsford Library and to touch the books that Scott had so cherished. And I'll never forget a late winter afternoon when the light was very bad in the Abbotsford Library, and we were about to leave because you can't work there much after 3 o'clock in the winter. And I said, let's just open this cupboard. Let's see what are in those volumes. And that's where we found the first 1,000 or so of the chapbooks in volumes in the Abbotsford cupboards. But that was a very rare privilege, and Jerry and I then went on to edit, as Peter said, Reliquiae Trotcosiensis, which is Scott's own humorous account of the building of Abbotsford and the collecting of the items that are on show there. In case we are in danger of taking Scott too seriously, Reliquiae is a reminder of his sense of humour and his ability to laugh at himself. As I began transcribing that manuscript in Scott's late hand, and a very difficult hand, I was really quite nervous about what I would find there. But of course, what we discovered was an intellect intact and an ability to use experience, both emotional and material, to tell stories, and also a lifelong ability to see the fun in things. Abbotsford itself almost stands as a metaphor for this, because in its library it houses the power store of Scott's vast knowledge. In its objects it carries the markers of the springboards for story that Scott recognised as one of the main purposes of antiquarianism, and in its fabric it's simultaneously old and new, innovative and a preserver of the past. The qualities that Virginia Woolf, of course, recognises in her essay Illumination at Abbotsford. As the staff of Abbotsford are now demonstrating so eloquently, it also reminds us of the role Scott played not only as a custodian of the past, but also as an early custodian of our planet through his interest in gardens, landscape and tree planting. Abbotsford encapsulates all of this, and it's the greatest of privileges to be the honorary librarian there. There's probably one other aspect of my journey with Scott that has been the most rewarding, and I should say something about that. Certainly one of the most enlightening, and that lies in the opportunities I've been given to teach Scott. I've been fortunate in that I've taught Scott at all levels at Aberdeen University and in a range of contexts, so from first year right through to graduate students. I've also had the privilege to work with many gifted young people studying on different projects. At Aberdeen, there's a rumour that if you look into Ali's eyes, you'll end up working on Walter Scott. This isn't actually true. I don't hypnotise people into studying Scott. But I think what is true is that if young people are given the opportunity to read Scott, and if they're freed from all the preconceptions that they've borne down upon him over 200 years, they'll want to keep reading Scott, and they will know that he's still relevant for them today. Indeed, they'll discover that Scott deals with some of the issues that are most pressing for today. In The Tale of Old Mortality, for example, they discover the extremes to which religious fanaticism might lead us. Through Waverley, they can explore the dangers of clinging to outmoded models of national identity, even when they become harmful. In Rob Roy, they can see the pressures that mount upon local communities in times of increasing globalisation. And in The Heart of Midlothian, Scott offers readers a sense of the complexities of family loyalties. I could go on with this list, but you all understand this already, that Scott is the most relevant of authors for today. Reading Scott is never boring, nor is it simply an exercise of reading a great writer from the past. In fact, it is constantly challenging, for the complexity of Scott's writing is such that we're never allowed to settle into fixed or lazy positions. On the contrary, every time I read Scott, I find that his work asks me new questions and demands more of me. It places increasing demands on its readers. As I grow older, I discover new things that are relevant in Scott, new nuances that had escaped my younger self. It's therefore fitting that we have gathered together to celebrate Sir Walter Scott, and that as we move towards a new future, we take Scott with us. For me personally, he's been a companion throughout my adult life, but he is surely one of the most fitting of companions for us, both personally and as a nation, in this time of transition, because his work offers a reminder that change will occur, that it is inevitable, but that if we confront it with our best selves, we can find a way to deal with it. Scott, I believe, also helps us to be our best selves. By reading his work, like that of all great writers, we can become better people. It is therefore with the greatest of pleasures that Mr. Chairman, Deputy Lord Provost, ladies and gentlemen, and Scott friends, I give the toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott.
Ali, that was a most thoughtful, personal and entertaining address. We're grateful to you for your year's presidency. Your continuing work on Scott is obviously of the highest calibre, and you're blessed with the ability to communicate what you're doing to people, which others sometimes lack. So thank you very much. Sir Walter Scott was born on the 15th of August 1771 in this city. He began his education in the high school here, and it was at the University in Edinburgh that he undertook his law classes. During the span of his professional career as a clerk of the Court of Session, he spent at least half of each year in Edinburgh, and it was while residing in Castle Street that a considerable amount of his work was written. One facet of the importance of the city in his life recently came into view for me when co-editing the volume on Scott's shorter poetry for Ali's grand edition. Scott attended innumerable Edinburgh society dinners, just as formal as this one, and frequently more rowdy. As an office holder, a speaker, and sometimes as the composer of the song which marked the occasion. To give just one quick example, in 1816 he was asked at short notice to provide verses for a dinner in honour of the Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia, brother to the Tsar Alexander I, to be held in Charlotte Square, and given by the then Lord Provost, Sir William Arbuthnot. The same William Arbuthnot who, I might add, no doubt with Scott's blessing and through his influence, was declared a Knight Baronet by George IV at a dinner held in the Advocates' Library during the royal visit in 1822. With this and other connections in mind, ladies and gentlemen, would you please rise again and join me in drinking a toast to the city of Sir Walter Scott's birth, the city of Edinburgh.
To Edinburgh.
I'm now delighted to invite the present Deputy Lord Provost, Joan Griffiths, to respond to our toast. Councillor Joan Griffiths, MBE, is Chair of Edinburgh Labour Group and Deputy Lord Provost. Having lived in Edinburgh all her life, she's on record as saying, "There's so much to do in Edinburgh. For me, there's nowhere else I would want to live. Edinburgh is a vibrant city with something for everyone: bars, restaurants, theatres." Among her pastimes, she loves walking on Portobello Beach and has the attitude essential to an Edinburgh existence that it doesn't matter what the weather is like, calm sea or not. She subscribes to the view that there's no such thing as bad weather, obviously, only inappropriate clothing. Her present role involves deputising for the Lord Provost, who you may recall was to have been present at the dinner as planned for the 1st of March, and we are both grateful and delighted that she can do so on the present occasion. Ladies and gentlemen, Edinburgh's Deputy Lord Provost, Joan Griffiths.
Thank you. Firstly, please accept the Lord Provost's apologies for being unable to attend this evening. I am, however, delighted to be with you all to respond to the toast to the city on his behalf, and to thank you, Professor Peter Garside, for such a wonderful toast. As Deputy Lord Provost of the City of Edinburgh, and as a citizen of Edinburgh, I feel very proud of our city's long and rich literary history. It is important that we take pride and celebrate our literary history. It is even more important that we encourage a new generation of readers and writers. I believe that literature is a potent vehicle for getting a message across. Edinburgh is often presented as an ancient city, rich in culture, architecture, and natural beauty, but it is much more than that. Edinburgh's heart and soul is its people, their talents and their aspirations. As you know, the Writers' Museum forms part of the City of Edinburgh Council's museum service and is dedicated to 3 of Scotland's greatest writers, Sir Walter Scott, Robert Burns and Robert Louis Stevenson. The museum welcomes thousands of visitors through its doors every year, a clear indication of the wonderful draw of Edinburgh's literary heritage to visitors both national and international, and of how much our literary heritage is valued. Recent investment and refurbishment of the museum has allowed for a creation for the first time of a gallery dedicated to Sir Walter Scott. It is here that some of the most interesting and intimate collection items are displayed, items that tell us a great deal about the man himself and not just his literary genius. One of the most popular exhibits, for example, is the Rocking Horse, which is believed to have belonged to him as a child. This was found in the attic of 25 George Square, where Scott lived with his parents until his marriage. Legal papers belonging to his father were discovered under a pad which had been attached to the seat of the rocking horse to serve as a cushion. As an infant, Scott contracted an illness, probably polio, which left him lame for life. This explains why the rocking horse has one footrest higher than the other. Also on display is a beautiful chessboard and chessmen, once the property of the great author. In his Life of Sir Walter Scott, J.G. Lockhart wrote, "But Scott did not pursue the science of chess after his boyhood. He used to say that it was a shame to throw away upon mastering a mere game. However ingenious, the time would suffice for the acquisition of a new language. Surely, he said, chess playing is a sad waste of a brain." The museum and its visitors are also enjoying being able to see a number of items that are on loan from private collectors and Scott enthusiasts. These include his writing desk, the very item where Waverley was rediscovered. In 1805, Scott began to write his first historical novel, Waverley. After completing a number of pages, he laid the manuscript aside in the mahogany writing desk, and then he moved to Abbotsford. The desk was stored away in a garret and forgotten. 8 years later, while searching for fishing tackle for a guest, Scott rediscovered his misplaced manuscript. He later recollects, "I immediately set to work upon completing according to my original purpose." Waverley, or "'Tis 60 Years Since," was published in 1814. A huge success. It sold out 6 editions in its first year. Perhaps most potently, though, are a pair of slippers, which Scott was gifted by friends in 1830, who were saddened by the state of the ones they found him wearing at his home in Abbotsford. A letter from Lady Badenoch reads, "The only thing we did not admire at Abbotsford was a pair of ugly, uncomfortable slippers we saw in your study. So my daughters hope you will replace them by theirs." Seemingly insignificant items, Scott's slippers tell a human story of the need for creature comforts and the compassion the author inspired in his friends, particularly at this valuable moment towards the end of his life. He was still mourning the loss of his wife and struggling to make ends meet during a banking crisis at this time. He had received advances on books he hadn't written yet, and a kind friend took pity on him and had these slippers made as a gift. An additional feature celebrating Edinburgh's literary heritage at the Writers' Museum is Macker's Court, a literary commemoration celebrating the lives and the works of Scottish writers. Each writer, including of course Scott, Burns and Stevenson, is commemorated by a quotation. The quotations are inscribed in stone and set in the paving leading from both the Mound and the Lawn Market to the door of the Writers' Museum. The quotation for Sir Walter Scott is taken from his poem, The Lady of the Last Minstrel. "This is my own, my native land." The city of Edinburgh continues to support the celebration of Edinburgh's literary heritage in many ways. Another initiative associated with the Writers' Museum is the Post of the Edinburgh Macker, instituted by the City of Edinburgh in 2002. This civic appointment is selected by representatives of the Scottish Poetry Library, the Scottish Pen, the Saltire Society, the City of Literature Trust and the City of Edinburgh Council. The current Edinburgh Macker is Alan Spence, who is a highly respected poet, playwright and novelist who acts as the city's literary ambassador at home and abroad, assisting in the promotion of poetry in partnership with literary organisations. Sir Walter Scott, a writer of prodigious output, gained prestige and influence both nationally and internationally, and his historical novels were not only an important influence on literature, painting and music in many countries, but changed attitudes towards the past. It is therefore with such great pleasure to celebrate Sir Walter Scott's heritage in the city, while also celebrating Edinburgh's great literary heritage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Deputy Lord Provost. And as your response illustrated, we are indeed blessed in Edinburgh by having civic authorities who are so aware of the importance of Edinburgh's culture, past and present. Each year it is the custom of the club to invite a representative of one of the many societies and establishments with which Sir Walter was associated to join us at our annual dinner. This year we're pleased to honour Scott's long-standing interest in and commitment to forestry, something he is on record as saying represented the greatest pleasure in life because it goes on from day to day and from year to year with perpetually augmenting interest. Immediately on purchasing the lands at Clarty Hole in 1811, Scott was talking to friends about two great ambitions. First, to build a cottage by the banks of the Tweed, and secondly, to begin planting at least half the small 120-acre estate of which he was now proprietor. In the event, Scott became involved in the afforestation of some 1,400 acres of ground surrounding Abbotsford. Only recently, on the club's behind-the-scenes visit to Abbotsford, we heard from Kirsty Archer-Thompson of plans to replant the now open area between the house and the river, according to Scott's original plans. Though I'd be unable to discover any contemporary forestry society of which Scott was a member, in 1823 he was part of a committee set up by the Highland Society to report on the activities of Sir Henry Stewart in transplanting trees on his estate at Allerton in Lanarkshire, and was heavily engaged in writing up the report. Though Scott subscribed to the Tory ideology that planting trees was a commendably selfless activity, since subsequent generations were the most likely to reap the benefits, he was not averse either to the potential, through transplantation, of wooding an area in 4 to 5 years rather than 40. Lockhart, in his biography, recalls how Scott attempted some of Sir Henry Stewart's methods at Abbotsford, though not experiencing the promised level of economy, either as a result of the conditions being different in Tweeddale, or Sir Henry having cooked the books a bit in favour of his scheme. While there may have been no bodies in Scott's day specifically devoted to forestry, there was interest plenty enough in agricultural development, and 3 decades after his death, his enthusiasms fed directly into the society we are here to honour today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses for our toast to the Royal Scottish Forestry Society. I'm very pleased now to ask the Honorary Vice President of the Royal Scottish Forestry Society, Christopher Ogilvie Badenoch, to respond to our toast. Christopher lives in Kelso and has half a century's experience in agriculture, nature conservation and forestry. As a founder member and former director of the Tweed Forum, he is renowned for his encyclopedic knowledge of all things Tweed. Other positions he has held or holds include Secretary to the Scottish Office Mooreburn Working Party, reporting to the Secretary of State for Scotland, and member of the South Scotland Regional Forestry Forum. He belongs to 4 rough shoots and has amateur gamekeeping experience of over 35 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Ogilvie Badenoch.
Thank you very much for that introduction, which is rather more than I expected. One of the problems of the departure of youth is the departure of memory. So I have to use a few crib sheets, but it is a real honour, ladies and gentlemen, for me to represent the Royal Scottish Forestry Society in this reply, and especially since I'm standing in for our president, James Hepburn Scott, direct relative of Sir Walter, who was here last month, I think, and who got me into this. He's a good friend. I do confess otherwise to be slightly biased in representing the 150-year-old society, whose motto is that of the Laird of Dumbydykes to his son in the heart of Midlothian, when he said, "Jock, when you hear nothing else today, you can aye be sticking in a tree. It'll be growing, Jock, while you're sleeping." Since, for my own part, I spent 10 years of my childhood in Scott's house in George Square, where he actually lived for longer than he did at Abbotsford. It's interesting that many of the neighbouring owners and tenants in the Great Square were often family friends who were also landowners in the borders. So, just what had Scott to do with trees and forestry? Scott's infantile paralysis, possibly polio, saw him whisked off to his grandparents' farm at Smelham, just outside Kelso, and there he returned frequently, and then also later to his Aunt Janet's house in Kelso, not 100 yards from where I live. He attended primary school there, and in these places he got his first taste of the border landscape, the ballads, and its history from his aunt, uncles, and grandparents. The important point here for us is that he was in fact in view and direct walking distance of the estates and farms, all busily beautifying their policies and making game coverts and commercial woodlands. Places like Floors Castle, Mellistine, Newton Don, Woden, Stitchhill, McKirsten, the Sudden, Merton, and so forth. When he got back to Edinburgh, the North Loch had been drained, and the trees of Hope Park, Bruntsfield, and Middle Meadow Walk were being established. Young Scott set up a range of mirrors, as the chairman has suggested, in his and my childhood bedroom, so that he could see what was going on in the meadows, in Bruntsfield, and in Middle Meadow Walk, where they were doing the planting. Also so that he could watch the yeomanry. But at the same time, the grazing tendency in the central park of George Square, for those of you who don't know it, it was grazed by cows and sheep, but it was also being terminated around then, and the trees and the shrubs were being planted in the garden. After his marriage in 1797, he lived in a cottage in Lasswade, partly, while he had Castle Street. And he and his wife Charlotte planted trees there, roses, honeysuckle, rowans, still evident there in the 1930s. Many of his friends, colleagues and professional contemporaries along the Esk were planting their policies at the same time at Pennycook, Hawthorne Den, Mavis Bank, Dalkeith, Dalhousie, and so on. Appointed from there to the sheriffdom of Selkirk at around 1800, he rented Ashesteel House in a wooded setting, still wooded, above the Tweed. There he did as much as early writing, and there is still an open knoll there in the wood called the Shiraz Now, where Marmion and some of his poems were hatched. From there he took long walks into what was the old Tweed ward of Ettrick Forest. His extensive raids on the borders, lore and poetry, his full songs, started from there. His depute, Robert Shortreed, pronounced that Scott did not make notes, but had a code apparently only known to himself, sounds like Leonardo, which he whittled onto twigs and branches, collected along the way, his wood notes. When he'd filled his own pockets with these, he then would use his friend's pocket. Shortreed said that after returning from a border raid, they discharged enough timber from their various habiliments as might have mended a mill. Shortreed also saw the wood notes strung above Scott's desk in Abbotsford, like the string alphabet of a blind man. So the availability of wood, or rather its lack in the borders, must have assumed quite importance for Scott. He acquired Abbotsford, as we've heard, in 1811, mine own dear place, and that gives us a clue, I think. He laid out around him his lands, and has enabled him to set about a vigorous programme of tree planting for landscape as well as for commerce. His detailed practical woodland management he recorded in his forestry journal, his own journal, still at Abbotsford, Silva, He wrote to a friend, "My oaks shall outlast my laurels." As a literary darling, of course, Scott had the opportunity as well to visit and advise on many estates developing grand policy woods throughout Britain and indeed the continent. He commented and criticised in print many ideas on forestry, contributing to major discourses, among others in the Planter's Guide, and as a historian he appreciated the enormous irony of an almost treeless Scotland from which men were being forced to emigrate while it was busy importing huge amounts of Scandinavian, Baltic and North American timber. Scott's boyhood and the ballads and sangs and his poems and novels sparked an interest and an overriding desire to be a laird with his own border family and their place. His thirst for land, coupled with the unfortunate business sense, his publisher's enormous debts, together with the period of crisis in the national economy, as the Lord Provost has said, it ruined him. But he saw it through. But we can safely say that if that decline started around 1818, Scott's later literary works were merely a day job to help pay off his ruin. His abiding love was unquestionably of forestry and trees and his own bit of land. I'd ask you to support the toast to a remarkable man and to an amazing forester. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Christopher. One of the remarkable things about this club, having come out of a narrow-minded academe in comparison, is how often we have as speakers people whose lives were so closely connected with Scott. And the fact that you lived in George Square and had the same bedroom as the young Walter Scott, it gives you a sort of authority to what you're saying. And I think also you put in a much wider context the phenomenon at that time of land and building forests and so on. To help round off our dinner, I'd now like to call on Alasdair Hutton OBE, the club's previous chairperson and a council member still, and I'm sure already known to most of you, or all of you, to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you. And of course, just to prove what you were saying, I lived for 20 years in the house that Walter Scott was left by his uncle, Captain Robert Scott. Oh, Chairman, this cannot be right. I feel a counterfeit, for I can never hope to match your eloquence and wit. However, I shall do my best, plucked from out your ranks, to do your bidding and to give your guests our grateful thanks. We've gathered goodly company in silk and tartan dressed, and with such talent as you've drawn tonight, we are richly blessed. We've dined tonight like Arthur's knights at tables round and cheer. I hope we'll do it all again when we will meet next year. It's fun to dine with cheerful folk and talk and drink and eat, so coming to the club tonight's a truly happy treat. Andrew Campbell and his staff have served us in grand style, so thanks to them for going on that valued extra mile. Alan gave us grace to start, from there the seeds were sown. With all his chief's due reverence, he set the evening's tone. Our worthy Presses gave us all a sage and witty treat. She entertained and she informed, her discourse was complete. With knowledge and a scholar's touch, her insight surely ranks among the best that we have had. So, Ali, here are thanks. The city's Deputy Provost Joan brought all her grace and art, reminding us that this is where Sir Walter made his start. Chris Badenoch gave his discourse upon the shearer's skill in choosing and implanting trees that we're enjoying still. A dinner like this does not spring complete from off the wall. It takes good folk to give their time to organise it all, and so our thanks, Louise and Lee. We're very glad that you gave up your time to do the work for this successful coup. And Peter, steered the whole event with his accustomed flair. We are so lucky in this club that he is in the chair. So to you all, we're very glad you've joined our humble ranks. This dinner has been tremendous fun. Accept our grateful thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Alasdair's vote of thanks brings our evening to a beautifully rounded and metrically, exquisitely perfect close. I look forward to seeing you at our various talks throughout the rest of the year. At our next event on the 17th of May, we'll hold our annual general meeting at 7 p.m, followed by a talk by Eileen Dunlop, former head of a proprietary school and author of a recent Life of Scott, on the topic Scott and the Primary School, Past and Future. The final talk during the first half of 2018 on the 14th of June will be given by Dr. Gillian Hughes in tandem with myself, relating to our work in preparing a volume of Scots short poetry, to be the second in Ali Lumsden's grand edition, and highlighting the twin existence of Edinburgh and European dimensions in Scots writing. These talks represent the lifeblood of the club, so please consider booking tickets from Lee Simpson if you haven't already done so. We are indeed blessed as a club in having in Sir Walter a figure capable of engendering a multitude of topics and activities. There are more talks and events to follow later in the year, which will be fully announced in the next Secretary's letter to members early in the summer. But for this evening, thank you all for coming, and have a safe journey home.
We were loving with our table. We did want to do
Righty.